Monkey! The word echoed in the tense silence. All eyes turned toward the officer who had just said it, the smirk on his face dripping with mockery. Officer Brad Halstead leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed as if daring the man in front of him to respond. The man he addressed stood tall and composed, his dark eyes piercing through the insult like a blade. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood out on the bustling street. He was clearly out of place, but not for the reasons Brad assumed. "Did you just call me a monkey?" the man asked calmly, though there was steel in his voice. "I did," Brad sneered, his hand brushing against the holster on his hip, as if reminding everyone who held the power. "What are you going to do about it?" The man didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on the growing crowd. Then, he took a single step forward, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Brad chuckled, the sound as grating as nails on a chalkboard. "Should I?" "What, you some big-shot lawyer? Think your fancy suit scares me?" The man tilted his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. But before he could answer, a piercing voice broke through the tension. "Brad!" Another officer, younger and clearly uncomfortable, rushed over, his face pale. "Maybe you should. Shut it, rookie!" Brad barked, silencing his colleague. His bravado was as loud as it was fragile. He turned back to the man. "Go on. Say whatever you've got to say. Then get out of my face." The man took another step closer, the crowd murmuring in anticipation. It was as if the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Let's just say," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "you'll be seeing me again. Very soon." The cliffhanger hung heavy in the air as the scene froze. The gravity of what was happening not yet fully realized. But it was far from over. Earlier that day, things had been different. It started with the new chief of police, Daniel Carter, stepping into his office for the first time. Daniel was a man of integrity and sharp intellect, but he was also no stranger to the uphill battles that came with his identity. At 42, he had risen through the ranks not because it was easy, but because he refused to be defined by the obstacles in his path. The police station buzzed with activity as he arrived. Officers were curious about their new boss, but not all the curiosity was positive. Some welcomed him, while others whispered behind his back. He noticed the looks, the raised eyebrows, and the judgment in their eyes. He walked through the halls with an easy confidence, stopping to introduce himself to anyone who crossed his path. Despite the whispers, he made it clear that he was here to lead, not to be liked. Brad Halstead wasn't in the station that morning. Had he been, perhaps things would have gone differently. But Brad, a seasoned officer with a reputation for pushing boundaries, was out on patrol. He'd always been loud, brash, and dismissive of anything he didn't understand. The news of a black man taking over as chief had rubbed him the wrong way, though he hadn't had a chance to voice his opinion. Yet, Daniel spent the morning settling into his office and meeting with key staff. He quickly learned who was willing to work with him and who would need convincing. The tension was palpable, but he wasn't fazed. He'd dealt with worse before. By lunchtime, Daniel decided to step out for a break. He loved walking through neighborhoods, getting a feel for the communities he served. It reminded him why he'd taken the job in the first place. That's when he crossed paths with Brad. Brad had stopped a car for a minor infraction, but the situation had escalated. The driver, a young black woman, was visibly shaken as Brad interrogated her, his tone dripping with disdain. Daniel observed from a distance, his instincts kicking in. He approached calmly, intending to de-escalate the situation. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel asked, his voice steady. Brad barely glanced at him. "Move along. Police business." I'm aware, Daniel said, stepping closer. I asked if there's a problem. Brad finally turned to face him, his expression hardening. He didn't recognize Daniel, and the suit threw him off. Who the hell are you? Daniel ignored the question and addressed the driver. Are you okay, Mom? The woman nodded hesitantly, her eyes darting between the two men. Brad, annoyed, stepped in front of Daniel, blocking his view. I told you to move along, Brad said, his voice rising. You interfering with an officer? No, Daniel said calmly. I'm simply observing. Observing, huh? Brad smirked. You one of those social justice types? Here to play hero? Daniel didn't take the bait. I'm here to make sure everyone's treated fairly. Brad's smirk twisted into a sneer. Oh, I see what this is. Another monkey sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. The words hung in the air, shocking everyone within earshot. For a moment, even Brad seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his bravado masking his unease. Daniel didn't react right away. He stood there, his expression unreadable, as if weighing his options. Then, slowly, he took out his phone and began typing. What are you doing? Brad asked, his tone defensive. Daniel didn't answer. He simply put his phone back in his pocket and smiled faintly. Like I said, you'll be seeing me again. The scene simmered as Daniel walked away, his composed demeanor contrasting starkly with the bubbling tension he left behind. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring about what they'd just witnessed. Brad stood rooted to the spot, fuming. He hated feeling out of control, and that stranger, whoever he was, had managed to strip away his usual air of authority with just a few words. What the hell was that about? Brad grumbled, turning to his rookie partner, Officer Jacobs. Jacobs hesitated, glancing around nervously. Maybe you should let this one go, Brad. That guy didn't seem like someone to mess with. Brad scoffed. Oh, come on. Just another loudmouth trying to make a scene. You see his suit? Bet he's some wannabe activist lawyer. He'll be crying to the media, saying I profiled him or some crap. They're all the same. Jacobs didn't reply. He'd only been on the force for 6 months, and he knew better than to challenge Brad directly. But something about the man in the suit didn't sit right with him. There was an air of authority around him that didn't match Brad's dismissive assumption. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to his car, still parked a few blocks away. He slid into the driver's seat and took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment to process what had just happened. He wasn't surprised by Brad's behavior. Had seen it too many times before, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, selecting a number marked with a star. After a few rings, a voice answered. Chief Carter, the voice said, warm and professional. How's the first day going? Eventful, Daniel replied dryly. I need you to pull some files for me. Of course, the voice said. What do you need? Officer Brad Halstead, Daniel said. I want everything. Personnel records, complaint history, performance reviews, the works. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Understood. Anything specific you're looking for? I just had a little interaction with him, Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say he needs closer scrutiny. Got it, the voice replied. He'll get back to you soon. Daniel ended the call and stared out the window for a moment. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He'd learned long ago to channel his emotions into action, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time Brad crossed the line, and next time, the consequences would be far more serious. Back at the station, Brad strutted in like nothing had happened. He slapped a hand on Jacob's shoulder as they walked through the doors. Relax, rookie, he said, grinning. I've been doing this for years. Guys like that don't scare me. Jacobs didn't respond, but his silence didn't faze Brad. He was already scanning the room for someone to brag to. He spotted a group of officers near the break room and sauntered over. You guys should have seen it, Brad said loudly, drawing their attention. Some big shot in a suit tried to tell me how to do my job. Thought he could intimidate me or something. The others chuckled, though a few exchanged uneasy glances. Brad's reputation preceded him, and not everyone was a fan. Still, no one dared to call him out. As Brad basked in the attention, the station's atmosphere shifted. Daniel had returned, this time dressed in his full uniform. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his presence commanded immediate respect. Officers paused mid-conversation as he walked through the room. Some straightened their posture. Others quickly busied themselves with paperwork. The air crackled with curiosity and apprehension. Brad didn't notice him at first. He was too busy regaling his audience with exaggerated details of the encounter. But when Daniel approached the group, the room fell silent. "Officer Halstead," Daniel said evenly. Brad turned, his grin fading as he registered who was speaking to him. "Hi." Confusion was evident, but he quickly masked it with his usual bravado. "Yeah? Who's asking?" Brad said, his tone still laced with defiance. Daniel didn't respond right away. He let the weight of the moment sink in, his gaze steady and unyielding. Finally, he extended a hand. "Chief Daniel Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe we've already met." The silence in the room was deafening. Brad's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He stared at Daniel, his mind racing to process what he'd just heard. "Wait," Brad said slowly, his bravado cracking. "You're the new chief?" Daniel didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and inescapable. The room buzzed with tension as everyone watched Brad's reaction. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face turned a shade paler as realization dawned. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice low enough for only Brad to hear. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He straightened up and addressed the room. "Carry on," he said, his voice commanding but not harsh. As he walked away, the buzz of conversation slowly resumed, though it was quieter than before. Brad remained frozen in place, his mind reeling. His bravado was gone, replaced by a sinking feeling in his gut. Hours later, Brad sat in the locker room, staring at his hands. He'd managed to avoid Daniel for the rest of the day, but he knew their conversation was inevitable. His mind raced with excuses, justifications, and denials, but none of them seemed convincing. The door creaked open, and Brad tensed. He didn't need to look up to know who had entered. "Officer Halstead," Daniel said, his tone calm but unyielding. Brad looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Chief," he said, forcing the word out. Daniel sat down on the bench across from him, his posture relaxed, but as he, "Yes, Sharp, we need to talk," Brad swallowed hard, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, Brad," he said quietly, "do you always call people monkeys, or was today special?" The question hung in the air, and Brad's face burned with shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Before he could gather his thoughts, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and stood up, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy your evening, Officer Halstead," Daniel said, his voice laced with a hint of warning. "Well, finish this conversation tomorrow." With that, he walked out, leaving Brad alone in the silence of the locker room, the weight of his actions finally beginning to sink in. The next morning, Brad woke up in a foul mood. Sleep had eluded him, and his mind churned with frustration and unease. He told himself he'd handle whatever talk the new chief had planned, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of his control. At the station, the atmosphere felt different. News of the previous day's events had spread, and Brad could sense the stares and whispers. Officers who usually greeted him with casual nods avoided his gaze. Even Jacobs, his rookie partner, kept his distance. Brad sat at his desk, pretending to focus on reports, when his email notification pinged. The subject line caught his eye. Meeting reminder, Chief Carter's office, 10 a.m. He checked the clock. 9:57. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stand, straighten his uniform, and make his way to the chief's office. When he arrived, Daniel was seated at his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up as Brad knocked and stepped inside. "Close the door," Daniel said without lifting his eyes. Brad obeyed. The quiet click of the door, sounding louder than its show. LD. He stood awkwardly, unsure whether to sit or remain standing. After a moment, Daniel finally looked up, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Have a seat, Officer Halstead," Daniel said, motioning to the chair across from him. Brad hesitated before sitting, his posture stiff. He cleared his throat, trying to project confidence. "Chief," he began, but Daniel held up a hand to stop him. "I'll speak first," Daniel said. His tone wasn't harsh, but it left no room for interruption. He slid the file across the desk toward Brad, who glanced at it but didn't pick it up. "I've reviewed your record," Daniel continued. "You've been on the force for over a decade. Commendations for bravery, good performance reviews from some supervisors, but there's another side to this file. Complaints. Quite a few of them." Brad's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Excessive force," Daniel listed off, flipping through the pages. "Unprofessional conduct, multiple allegations of discriminatory behavior. None of it led to formal disciplinary action, but the pattern is clear." "With all due respect, Chief," Brad interrupted, "those complaints were baseless. People make stuff up to get out of trouble. You know how it is." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Do I?" Brad faltered, realizing too late the implications of what he'd just said. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "Let me make something very clear, Officer Halstead," Daniel said, his voice steady but cutting. "You represent this department every time you put on that uniform. Your actions reflect on all of us. And yesterday, what you said to me, what you called me, was not only disrespectful, but it also showed a level of arrogance and ignorance that has no place in this station." Brad shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered defensively. "That doesn't make it any better," Daniel shot back. "You didn't know I was your chief, so you felt entitled to treat me and anyone else you don't respect with blatant disregard. Tell me, Brad, how many other people have you spoken to that way? How many other monkeys have you dealt with on your patrols?" The question landed like a blow, and Brad's face reddened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel wasn't finished. "You may have gotten away with this kind of behavior in the past," Daniel said. "But under my leadership, that ends now." Brad bristled. "Are you saying you're out to get me?" "No," Daniel replied coolly. "I'm saying I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to attend mandatory sensitivity training. You're also going to undergo a full review of your conduct, past and present. If there's evidence of misconduct, appropriate action will be taken." Brad's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Daniel said. "This is your chance to prove you can do better. Don't waste it." Brad stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is a witch hunt," he spat. "You're targeting me because you've got a chip on your shoulder." Daniel didn't rise to the bait. He simply stood, meeting Brad's glare with unwavering calm. You can believe whatever you want, Officer Halstead, he said, but I suggest you take a good, hard look at yourself. Because if you don't, your time here may be shorter than you think. Brad stormed out, slamming the door behind him. His anger simmered as he stalked through the station, ignoring the curious glances from his colleagues. He didn't care what they thought. He was determined to prove he wasn't the problem. Later that day, Brad was assigned to a routine patrol with Jacobs. The rookie was clearly uneasy, fidgeting in the passenger seat as Brad drove. You gonna say something, or just sit there squirming? Brad snapped. Jacobs hesitated. I think you should take what the chief said seriously. Brad laughed bitterly. Oh, you're on his side now. It's not about sides, Jacobs said quietly. It's about doing the job right. Brad didn't respond, gripping the steering wheel tightly as they cruised through the neighborhood. He refused to let anyone lecture him, least of all a rookie and a chief who didn't know how things worked in the real world. The patrol was uneventful until they received a call about a disturbance at a local park. When they arrived, they found a group of teenagers arguing loudly. Brad stepped out of the car, his irritation bubbling over as he barked at them to quiet down. One of the teens, a tall boy with dreadlocks, stood his ground. We're not doing anything wrong, he said. Why are you hassling us? Brad's temper flared. Watch your tone, kid, he snapped. You want to spend the night in a cell? The boy glared at him but said nothing. Jacobs shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Brad and the teens. Brad, Jacobs said quietly. Maybe we should just, I've got this. Brad cut him off. He turned back to the teens. Break it up. Now. Reluctantly, the group began to disperse, though the boy with dreadlocks shot Brad a look of pure defiance before walking away. Brad felt a flicker of satisfaction. He'd shown them who was in charge. But as they drove away, Jacobs couldn't shake the feeling that Brad's approach had only made things worse, and he wasn't the only one. Back at the station, Daniel watched the body cam footage from Brad's patrol, his expression darkening. It was clear that Brad hadn't learned a thing, and the consequences were just beginning. Brad's day spiraled further after the park incident. The tension between him and Jacobs was palpable, though Jacobs avoided confronting him directly. As the hours dragged on, Brad's frustration only grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was against him. Jacobs, the chief, even the community. Back at the station, Daniel sat in his office reviewing the escalation report. The internal affairs team had expedited their investigation after his call, uncovering troubling patterns in Brad's conduct. The body cam footage from the park incident confirmed what Daniel had suspected. Brad's approach to policing wasn't just abrasive, it was a liability. As Daniel prepared for a department-wide meeting, he was interrupted by a knock at his door. Come in, he said, looking up. Jacob stepped inside, his expression nervous. Chief, can I speak with you? Daniel gestured for him to sit. What's on your mind, Officer Jacobs? Jacobs hesitated, fidgeting with his hands. It's about Brad. Officer Halstead. Daniel's eyes sharpened, but he remained silent, encouraging Jacobs to continue. I've been riding with him for 6 months now, Jacobs said. At first, I thought he was just old school, Tough but fair. But lately, it's been different. He doesn't listen. He escalates situations instead of calming them down. And yesterday, he trailed off, visibly uncomfortable. Go on, Daniel prompted. Jacob swallowed hard. Yesterday, when he called you, when he said that word, I realized it wasn't just about how he treats suspects. It's about how he sees people. He doesn't respect them, and that's dangerous. Daniel nodded slowly. Thank you for coming to me with this, Officer Jacobs. It takes courage to speak up, especially about a colleague. Jacobs looked relieved but still uneasy. I just want to do the job right, Chief. I don't want to end up like him. You won't, Daniel said firmly. but it's going to take work to change the culture here. And that starts with accountability. Jacobs nodded and left the office, leaving Daniel to consider his next steps. That evening, Brad sat at home nursing a beer. The day had been a disaster, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things were about to get worse. He turned on the TV, hoping to distract himself, but the local news only deepened his unease. And in other news, sources inside the city's police department suggest that newly appointed Chief Daniel Carter is taking a hard stance on officer misconduct, the anchor said. Rumors of an internal investigation have sparked debate about the department's future. More details to come. Brad clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening around the bottle in his hand. He felt cornered, and the pressure was mounting. The next day, Daniel called a department-wide meeting. The officers gathered in the briefing room, the air thick with anticipation. Brad slouched in his seat, arms crossed, as Daniel stepped to the front of the room. "Good morning," Daniel began, his tone calm but commanding. "I called this meeting because it's time for a serious conversation about the standards we hold ourselves to as officers of this department." He let his words sink in before continuing. "We have a responsibility to serve and protect this community. That means treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. Unfortunately, there have been instances where we've fallen short of that responsibility." The room was silent, though a few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel's gaze swept over them, his expression unreadable. "I won't name names," he said, though his eyes lingered on Brad for a fraction of a second. "But let me be clear. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Accountability starts now." He outlined the new policies he was implementing: mandatory sensitivity training, stricter oversight of body cam footage, and zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. The room buzzed with murmurs, some officers nodding in agreement while others exchanged skeptical looks. After the meeting, Brad cornered a few of his usual allies in the locker room. "Can you believe this?" he hissed. "He's trying to make us look like the bad guys, like we're the problem." One officer shrugged. "Maybe you are the problem, Brad." The words hit harder than Brad expected. He scowled and stormed out, his frustration boiling over. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, and it made him reckless. Later that day, Brad responded to a call about a shoplifting incident at a convenience store. When he arrived, the suspect was already being held by the store manager, a young black man in his 20s who looked more scared than guilty. "What'd he take?" Brad asked gruffly. "Just a sandwich," the manager said. "But he didn't pay, and I can't let that slide." Brad glared at the suspect. "Got any money?" The man shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I was hungry. I didn't know what else to do." Brad's temper flared. "That's not my problem. Hands behind your back." The man hesitated, glancing at the sandwich on the counter. "Please, officer, I'll leave." "I won't come back. I said hands behind your back." Brad barked, reaching for his cuffs. Before he could act, Jacobs arrived on the scene, having been dispatched as backup. He immediately took in the situation and stepped between Brad and the suspect. "Wait," Jacobs said. "Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Brad snapped. "He broke the law." "And he's stealing food because he's hungry," Jacobs countered. "We can handle this without an arrest." Brad glared at him, his jaw tightening. "Since when do you call the shots?" Jacobs didn't back down. "Since we're supposed to serve and protect. This isn't serving anyone." The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Finally, Brad relented, stepping back with a scowl. "Fine," he muttered. "Your call." Jacobs spoke calmly to the suspect, resolving the situation without incident. But as they left the store, Brad's anger boiled over. "You undermine me," he snarled. "Don't ever do that again." "I did what was right," Jacobs said evenly. "Maybe you should try it sometime." The confrontation left Brad seething, his authority slipping further through his fingers. And this time, the body cam footage told a story he couldn't control. That evening, Daniel reviewed the footage, his expression grim. Brad's behavior had crossed yet another line, and Daniel knew it was time to act decisively. He picked up the phone and made a call. Internal Affairs? It's Chief Carter. I need you to move forward with disciplinary action against Officer Halstead. Effective immediately. Brad's day started with a phone call he wasn't prepared for. Officer Halstead, the voice on the other end began, sharp and formal. This is Lieutenant Ramirez from Internal Affairs. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a formal review of your conduct. You are to report to the station at noon to surrender your badge and weapon. What? Brad barked, his voice rising. This is a joke, right? No, Officer Halstead, this is not a joke, Ramirez replied, her tone unyielding. Fail to comply, and we will escalate the matter accordingly. The line went dead before Brad could muster a response. His chest tightened, and a deep, seething anger bubbled up inside him. This was Chief Carter's doing. He was sure of it. When Brad arrived at the station later that morning, the atmosphere was tense. His colleagues avoided making eye contact, and whispers followed him down the hall. He slammed open the door to the Internal Affairs ICE, where Ramirez and Daniel were waiting. Take a seat, Ramirez instructed curtly. Brad didn't sit. Instead, he glared at Daniel, his face flushed with anger. This is your fault, he spat. You've been out to get me since the day you showed up. Daniel remained calm, meeting Brad's fury with steady resolve. This isn't personal, Brad, he said. It's about your actions. My actions, Brad snapped. I've done my job for years. Maybe not your way, but it's gotten results. And at what cost? Daniel countered. Respect? Trust? The reputation of this department? We're supposed to serve the community, not alienate them. Save the speech, Brad shot back. You're just here to make yourself look good. You don't care about this department, you care about your agenda. Ramirez stepped in before the argument escalated further. Officer Halstead, this meeting isn't for debate. You're here to surrender your badge and weapon. Now. Brad hesitated, his gaze darting between Ramirez and Daniel. Finally, with a sneer, he unhooked his badge and holster, slamming them onto the desk. This isn't over, he growled before storming out. The station buzzed with the fallout from Brad's suspension. Some officers supported Daniel's decision, while others grumbled that he was too harsh. The divide was clear, but Daniel stood firm. He knew this was about more than one officer, it was about setting a standard for the department. That afternoon, Daniel visited a community center where he'd arranged a meeting with local leaders. The goal was to rebuild trust between the police and the neighborhoods they served, and he wanted to hear directly from the people most affected by the department's flaws. The meeting began with tension in the air. The room was filled with activists, clergy, and residents, many of whom had first-hand experiences of mistrust and fear when dealing with the police. Daniel listened intently as they shared their stories, taking notes and asking questions. One woman, an older resident named M. Riz Robinson, spoke with tears in her eyes. We used to be able to call the police when we needed help, she said. Now we're too scared they'll make things worse. My grandson? He won't even walk to the store without looking over his shoulder. Daniel nodded solemnly. I can't change the past, he said, but I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to ensure this department becomes something you can trust again. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. His sincerity resonated with many in the room, though skepticism lingered. As the meeting wrapped up, Daniel exchanged contact information with several attendees, promising to stay in touch and work collaboratively. Meanwhile, Brad sat alone in his apartment, stewing in bitterness. His phone buzzed with messages from a few sympathetic colleagues, but the support felt hollow. He flipped on the TV to distract himself, but the local news made his blood boil. Chief Daniel Carter met with community leaders today to discuss efforts to reform the city's police department, the anchor said. Sources indicate that Carter has already taken steps to address officer misconduct, including the suspension of a veteran officer. Brad threw the remote at the wall, the crack of plastic shattering echoing through the room. He couldn't stand the thought of Daniel being praised while he was vilified. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Yeah, it's me," he said when the line connected. "I need a favor." The next morning, Daniel received an email from Ramirez. It included a detailed summary of the investigation into Brad's conduct, as well as recommendations for disciplinary action. The evidence was damning. Body cam footage, complaint records, and even statements from other officers painted a clear picture of a pattern of abuse. Daniel drafted a formal report to the city council, outlining his findings and the steps he was taking to address the issues. He knew this wouldn't be the end of the matter. Brad was likely to fight the charges, but he was prepared for the battle ahead. As Daniel finished the report, his assistant knocked on the door. "Chief Carter, you have a visitor," she said, her tone hesitant. "Who is it?" Daniel asked. "Mrs. Robinson," she replied. "She says it's urgent." Daniel frowned but nodded. "Send her in." Mrs. Robinson entered, her face etched with worry. "Chief Carter," she said, her voice trembling, "something's happened to my grandson." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "He was walking home last night, and some officers stopped him," she said. "They said he looked suspicious. He's in the hospital now. He says they roughed him up." Daniel arrived at the hospital, his mind racing with questions. As he walked into the emergency room, Mrs. Robinson led him to her grandson's room. The boy, Greg, was lying in bed with a swollen eye, bruises along his arms, and a split lip. The sight made Daniel's jaw tighten. "Greg," Daniel said gently, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I'm Chief Carter. I'm here to find out what happened." Greg glanced at his grandmother, then back at Daniel. His voice was shaky but clear. "I was walking home from the basketball courts. It was late, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. These two cops pulled up and they started asking me all these questions." "What kind of questions?" Daniel asked, his tone calm but focused. "They wanted to know why I was out so late, where I was going." "If I had drugs on me," Greg said, his eyes welling with tears. "I told them I didn't have anything, but they didn't believe me. One of them grabbed me and threw me against the car. I didn't fight back, I swear." Daniel's fists clenched under the table. "Did you see their names or badge numbers?" Greg H.H. hesitated. "I didn't see their names, but one of them he had a scar on his chin, and he kept saying stuff like, 'Kids like you need to learn respect.'" Daniel's heart sank. The description sounded all too familiar. He nodded and placed a reassuring hand on Greg's shoulder. "I'm going to look into this," he promised. "You didn't deserve this." Mrs. Robinson followed Daniel into the hallway, her face etched with worry. "Chief, is it true you're suspending officers who step out of line?" "It is," Daniel said. "And if I find out the officers who did this violated protocol, they'll face consequences." Mrs. Robinson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good. Because this isn't the first time I've heard stories like this, but it needs to be the last." Back at the station, Daniel called an emergency meeting with Ramirez and his internal affairs team. He relayed Greg's account and ordered a full review of all patrol officers on duty the previous night. "Start with Brad Halstead," Daniel said. "He's suspended, but I want to confirm he wasn't involved." Ramirez nodded. "Understood." "Well, also, pull GPS data from the patrol cars. If Greg can identify the officers, it'll help narrow things down." As the investigation unfolded, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to Brad. The description of the officer with the scar on his chin matched one of Brad's closest allies, Officer Tim Givens. Givens had been vocal in his disapproval of Daniel's leadership, and his record wasn't spotless either. The next day, Ramirez delivered the initial findings. The GPS data confirmed that Givens's patrol car had been in the area at the time of the incident. Furthermore, the body cam footage showed a disturbing scene: Givens and his partner stopping Greg, questioning him aggressively, and eventually forcing him against the car. But the footage also revealed something else. Givens made a phone call after the incident, and though his words weren't fully audible, it was clear he was reporting back to someone. Daniel played the clip on repeat, his stomach sinking with each watch. He had a hunch about who Givens was calling, but he needed proof. Meanwhile, Brad sat at a diner on the outskirts of town, nursing a cup of coffee. He felt isolated, abandoned by the department he'd served for years. But he wasn't out of options. Givens had assured him he'd handle things, and Brad hoped that meant putting pressure on Daniel. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a text from Givens. "We've got a problem. Call me." Brad stepped outside and dialed the number. "What's going on?" he asked. "Internal Affairs is sniffing around," Givens said, his voice tense. "They're asking about the kid from last night. Carter's got them all over this." Brad's grip on the phone tightened. "What you tell them?" "Nothing yet," Givens replied. "But the footage doesn't look good. They might pin this on us." Brad cursed under his breath. "You didn't use my name, did you?" "Of course not," Givens said. "But they're not stupid, Brad. They're going to figure it out." Brad's mind raced. If Givens flipped under pressure, everything would come crashing down. He needed to act fast. Back at the station, Daniel received a call from Ramirez. "Chief, we've got confirmation. Givens was one of the officers involved in the incident with Greg, and we have evidence he made a call to Brad Halstead afterward." Daniel's chest tightened. "What about the other officer?" "His partner is clean," Ramirez said. "It looks like Givens was the instigator." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He needed to confront this head-on, but it couldn't just be about Brad and Givens. It had to be about changing the culture that allowed this behavior to thrive. "Bring them both in," Daniel said. "Givens and Halstead. I want to hear their explanations." That afternoon, Brad received another call, this time from Ramirez. "Officer Halstead, we need you to come in for questioning regarding an ongoing investigation." Brad's stomach dropped. He knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. "Do I have a choice?" he asked bitterly. "You don't," Ramirez replied. "Be here by 3 p.m. Brad walked into the station at exactly 3 p.m., his face set in a mask of defiance. The whispers followed him as he made his way to the interrogation room. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let anyone see him sweat. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. Inside the room, Ramirez and Daniel were waiting. The air was thick with tension as Brad took a seat, his body stiff and defensive. "Officer Halstead," Ramirez began, her tone clipped. "This is a formal inquiry into your potential involvement in an incident involving the unlawful detention and assault of Greg Robinson." Brad's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't even on duty that night." "That's true," Ramirez replied, her expression neutral. "But we have evidence that Officer Givens contacted you shortly after the incident. Care to explain?" Brad's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected them to move this fast. "Givens is a friend," he said, keeping his voice steady. "He calls me all the time." "That doesn't mean I had anything to do with this." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Did you know what he did? Did he tell you about stopping Greg Robinson?" Brad met his eyes, forcing himself to stay calm. "I didn't know anything about it," he said. "Whatever Givens did, that's on him." Ramirez slid a transcript across the table. This is from Givens's body cam footage. The audio picks up a phone call where he says, "Don't worry, I've got this handled. He was talking to you, wasn't he?" Brad's stomach churned. He glanced at the transcript but didn't respond. Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "The culture of this department is changing, Brad. If you were part of the year, I saw if you encouraged it, it won't be swept under the rug. You have one chance to come clean." Brad's hands curled into fists under the table. He felt cornered, but his pride wouldn't let him admit anything. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said through gritted teeth. The door opened and Ramirez's assistant entered, handing her a new folder. Ramirez glanced at the contents, then slid it to Daniel. He scanned the document, his expression hardening. "This just came in," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "We pulled Givens' phone records. He called you 3 times after the incident. And the last call lasted nearly 10 minutes. What were you discussing?" Brad's jaw tightened. "We talk about a lot of things. It doesn't mean I had anything to do with that kid." Daniel leaned back, studying Brad carefully. "You're not helping yourself here, Brad. The evidence is stacking up, and Givens won't take the fall alone. He'll talk if it means saving himself." Brad's heart sank. He knew Givens wasn't loyal enough to protect him, especially under pressure. But admitting involvement meant giving Daniel exactly what he wanted, and Brad wasn't ready to do that. "I'm done talking," Brad said, standing abruptly. "If you've got something on me, charge me. Otherwise, I'm leaving." "You're free to go," Ramirez said coolly. For now, Brad stormed out, his blood boiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. After Brad left, Daniel and Ramirez reviewed the case. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough to pin Brad directly to the assault. They needed Givens to confirm his role. Later that evening, Daniel sat in his office, contemplating his next move. A knock on the door broke his train of thought. "Come in," he called. Jacobs entered, looking uneasy. "Chief, can I speak with you?" Daniel gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Officer Jacobs?" Jacobs hesitated before speaking. "It's about Brad. I know I shouldn't be talking about this, but I think he's in deeper than he's letting on." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What makes you say that?" "I've heard him and Givens talk," Jacobs said, lowering his voice. "They're always complaining about how you're running the department, saying you're soft and how things were better before you got here. And yesterday, when we were in the locker room, I overheard Brad telling Givens not to drag him into this. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now," Daniel nodded, his mind racing. "Thank you for telling me this, Jacobs. It's important that we hold everyone accountable." Jacobs hesitated. "Do you think this will really change anything, Chief? I mean, Brad's been here forever." "People look up to him." Daniel's expression softened. "Change isn't easy, Jacobs, but it starts with accountability. If we let this slide, we're telling the community that their trust doesn't matter, and I won't let that happen." Meanwhile, Brad met with Givens in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. The 2 men sat in a corner booth, speaking in hushed tones. "They're coming for me," Brad said, his voice low but tense. "And if they get me, they'll come for you next." Givens frowned, nursing his drink. "What do you want me to do, Brad? They've got footage. They've got my phone records. I can't deny what happened." "You keep your mouth shut," Brad hissed. "That's what you do. If you roll over, they'll bury both of us." Givens looked uneasy. "I don't know, man. Carter's not like the old chiefs. He doesn't back down." Brad slammed his fist on the table, drawing a few glances from other patrons. "You let me handle Carter. Just don't do anything stupid." Brad's last card was a desperate one, but he didn't see another way out. He decided to confront Daniel directly, hoping to intimidate him into backing off. As far as Brad was concerned, the fight had become personal, and he wasn't going down without a final attempt to regain control. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the station early, already deep in thought about the case against Brad and Givens. As he walked through the parking lot, he heard a voice behind him. "Chief." Daniel turned to find Brad leaning against his car, his arms crossed, and a smirk on his face. The smirk didn't reach his eyes, though. They were filled with something closer to desperation. "Brad," Daniel said evenly, stopping a few feet away. "What are you doing here? You're on leave." "I wanted to talk," Brad said, pushing himself off the car, man to man. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Talk, then." Brad stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't need to ruin both our careers over this. You back off, I back off. We both walk away, clean." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be an offer or a threat?" "It's common sense," Brad said, his tone hardening. "You've got people in this department who don't like you, Carter. They don't trust you. You take me down, you're just proving them right. You're making enemies you don't need." Daniel didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Brad, the only person ruining your career is you. I didn't make you call me a monkey. I didn't make you ignore protocol. And I certainly didn't make you drag Givens into this mess." Brad's face flushed, his confidence faltering. "I've done this job for 15 years. I know how to deal with people like Greg Robinson. You don't." Daniel's gaze hardened. "You mean black people? Poor people? People you think are beneath you?" Brad opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel cut him off. "You've had years to fix your approach, Brad. Years to do better. Instead, you chose arrogance over accountability. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Brad's fists clenched, his body trembling with barely contained rage. But he didn't respond. He turned on his heel and stalked away, muttering under his breath. Inside the station, Ramirez met Daniel with a satisfied expression. "We've got Givens," she said. "He cracked this morning. He admitted Brad was the one who encouraged him to stop Greg and rough him up, just to send a message." Daniel nodded. "Good. Prepare a full report for the city council and the district attorney. I want them to know exactly what we're dealing with." By the end of the day, Brad's suspension turned into a termination. Givens was charged with assault, and an official investigation was launched into past complaints against both men. The announcement sent shock waves through the department, but it also sent a message. The days of unchecked misconduct were over. 2 weeks later, Daniel returned to the community center where he'd first met Greg and Mrs. Robinson. This time he brought good news. "The officers involved in Greg's case have been removed from the force," Daniel told the gathered residents. "One of them is facing charges, and we're working to make sure this kind of behavior isn't tolerated in the future." Mrs. Robinson's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Chief. I didn't think anyone would ever listen." Daniel smiled gently. "You deserve to be heard, Mrs. Robinson, and Greg deserves to feel safe in his own neighborhood." As the meeting continued, Daniel felt a sense of hope. The road ahead would be long, but he was determined to keep moving forward. Brad, meanwhile, found himself alone in his apartment, the weight of his choices finally crashing down on him. He had no job, no allies, and no one to blame but himself. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of accountability. Months later, the department began to rebuild its relationship with the community. New training programs were implemented, complaints were taken seriously, and officers like Jacobs became symbols of the positive change Daniel had worked so hard to bring. Greg, now healed from his injuries, returned to the basketball courts without fear. And Daniel, standing at the sidelines one afternoon, watched as the boy laughed with his friends. It was a small moment, but it represented everything he'd fought for.